Hi, Nicole. And let's talk something about you. Can you tell me, what kind of journey as a fashion historian you are? Like, what sparked your interest in fashion history? Something about your background. Like, let's get started with that first.
Yeah, so I learned how to sew when I was very little, and I got into theater when I was in high school as a teenager and really loved costuming. So that became what I went to college for. And at that university, I learned that I basically really liked all of the research portions when I was doing historical plays or musicals or things like that. When I was doing modern stuff, it wasn't nearly as exciting. And I had a few great, really amazing history professors when I was at university as well, and they sort of rekindled my interest in that area. So I ended up doing a lot of research and a lot of writing on very surface level stuff at that point. And then after college, I got a job at a museum on the East Coast where we worked in 18th century clothing. And I actually worked behind the scenes making the clothing for a few years, eventually was also dressed in clothing and interpreting myself. And sort of just kind of led from there. I eventually went to graduate school for fashion history after about 8 years at the museums and have sort of continued from there. So it's just become less about the sewing and the clothing and more about the history as I've gradually gone along, I think.
Yeah. So, one personal question I would want to ask you is which particular era do you admire? Like, not from just fashion or clothing stuff, but like from a general background. Like, w which one do you prefer the most till date?
Oh, that's a tough one. I have found myself really fond of the 19 teens right before we transition into modern things. It's a crazy decade. Every single year is different, wildly different. They go from very straight lines in 1912 to big fluffy skirts in 1915, and then back down to the very straight 1920s style as we think of it by the end of the decade. It's just all over the place. And I can only think of how difficult that must have been for everyone to keep up, but how exciting it also must have been because, things were changing so much during
Mm.
that 10-year span, but also changing in terms of the war and society and culture
Yeah.
and technology and everything. Like that just would
Yeah.
have been like, it seems crazy within my lifetime, the things that I've seen in technology, but that
Uh-huh.
seems like that would have just been so much.
Like, being a part of millennial is like, experiencing two different worlds altogether. I do
Yes.
get it. Yeah. So, talking about the 1920s to be specific over here, because the research is all about, that era. So, in your research and career, have you ever encountered any interesting or surprising facts about 1920s fashion that most people might not know?
Yeah, in general, I think for me, when I first started researching 1920s, I thought of it as, the flapper era, this very straight, plain, very boyish style that was the 1920s. And that's how I defined the entire decade. But the reality was that it changed so much over those 10 years, no different than the 19 teens had changed. They continued with that trend, and they are the sort of where we settled into modern fashion. Even though we don't dress exactly like that anymore, we still wear athleisure, sportswear. That was what really took off the 1920s, the casual aspect rather than super formal, an afternoon dress versus a tea gown versus a dinner dress versus a formal dinner, opera, theater, all of those crazy things. They had such long lists of exactly what you were supposed to wear for every situation. And in the 1920s, they just got tired of it and they threw out most of that. And so they were no longer looking to the very wealthy, fancy people to decide this is what we are going to wear.
Mhm.
Instead, they were looking towards fashion as a much more middle class thing where anyone could participate. It was more about were enough people wearing this thing to make it trendy, which
Mm,
is where we ended up today. Mass production, fast fashion, all of those things took off during that time period. All the things that we are still good or bad dealing with at this point in
mhm.
time.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very true. Very true. I totally agree with you. Uh, that said, like, what do you think about the, how would you define characteristics of uh, women's fashion, I would say, during the 1920s? Like, how would you define it? Like,
Yeah, the term that they would reference over and over again is boyish,
mhm,
and youthful. So for them, it was almost in a way they were harkening back to children's clothing, not necessarily in like a weird way, but because children's clothing was made to be active and functional. So they were wearing much more simple styles with fewer layers. They got rid of all the extra petticoats. Their clothing was now more washable, so that meant they didn't need all those under layers to absorb all the sweat and the stuff. The outer clothing could be washed more easily. So everything simplified down and made it so they could be more active. They could go and be out in public doing all sorts of things, not just exercising and doing physical activities and playing
mhm.
sports and games, but just simply going out for the day and spending all day walking around, shopping, working,